Chapter 3, Tissues. So a basic definition of tissues is a group of specialized cells and their products that perform a specific function. And probably the most straightforward tissue you can think of is muscle tissue. We're familiar with muscles. So muscle tissue is made up of specialized muscle cells, and their unique or special specific function is that they can contract to generate movement. So here's a histological slide of actually two tissues. One is an epithelial tissue, this first box down here, which is the lining of the gut, small intestine, and underneath it is a attaching connective tissue. And actually there's even another layer here that I didn't recognize at first, which is a muscular layer. So this is a group of tissues in the gut or the digestive tract. So again, 4 tissue types, as we mentioned in one of the previous chapters. There's epithelial tissue, connective tissue, these are just abbreviations, ET and CT, muscle tissue, and then nervous tissue. And there are subtypes within these tissues, as we'll see in this chapter. Okay, so starting with epithelial tissue. Epithelia covers surfaces, like your skin is covered by an epithelium or an epithelia. Inside your mouth, within your esophagus, throat, within your digestive tract, inside your nasal passages, inside your ear canal, that sort of thing. So epithelial tissue is unique because it covers surfaces. Its basic characteristics, it's very, very cellular, meaning the cellularity of the tissue. When you do look at epithelial tissue, one of the basic characteristics is it's essentially all cells just stuck together. In this picture here, this upper surface down to this little line here is the epithelial tissue. And you can tell that it's all cellular because of these little round and oval structures that you see inside that are a little darker than the surrounding kind of background, and those are the nuclei. And the reason they're darker is because when they prepare a slide, they stain it, colorize it so that it's readily visible on a microscope. And the nuclei pick up the stain quite a bit, or readily, so they always appear darker. And then the plasma membrane of the cell tends to pick up stain as well. So you can see these little lines, and those are the plasma membranes of the individual cells. Down below here, this is an underlying tissue. It simply looks different from up here. So simply since it looks so different, it's a good guess to assume that it's a different tissue, and it is. It's an underlying connective tissue. And the connection, the boundary between these two different tissues is this little faint line, and that's the basement membrane. Okay, so cellularity of epithelial tissues, the cells are tightly bound together. We talked about cell junctions in a previous chapter. There's a polarity to the cells, meaning there's a up, down, left, and right. And what we say is that the top of the cells is the apical surface. The bottom of the cell is the basal surface. Now, whether this is, upside down or not, in other words, say this is the top of your head, and it's the skin on the top of your head, and the cells on the skin on the top of your head. This would be the apical surface, okay, where the hair is growing out. But let's consider the skin on the bottom of your feet. The surface of the skin cells on the bottom of your feet that are in contact with the ground, this still would be the apical surface, okay? And then where the cells attach to the basement membrane in this diagram, that's the basal surface, okay? So there's a apical and basal direction or polarity to the cells. And then on the sides, that's considered the lateral surfaces. So the cells tend to be anchored, attached to each other on their lateral sides. So polarity just means directionality of the cells. The cells are attached at the basement membrane to the underlying connective tissue. So this basement membrane is sometimes kind of straight, a little squiggly, and sometimes very convoluted. In this right picture, it's pretty obvious that this tissue up here is different from this one over here. On this picture, with just a little observation, you should be able to recognize that, okay, I see nuclei here. I see a lot of cells. I see a squiggly line. And then down underneath, deeper, it looks different. Must be two different tissues. The boundary is the basement membrane. That's an epithelial tissue. That's another one. Another characteristic of epithelial tissues is since they are coverings to on the body or on organs, there's going to be a layer that's exposed to either air or to an internal passageway. So this apical surface of this tissue, it's a clear line. It might be wavy, might be convoluted, but there's nothing above it. So it's exposed to either air or an internal cavity. So let's say this is your windpipe, your trachea. This would be the passageway where air moves. Here's a distinct edge. In other words, there's nothing up here. And then there's the distinct edge, and that edge, a distinct clear edge, is really characteristic of an epithelial tissue. And then underneath, connective tissue is not in contact or does not have this clear edge against nothing. It is always in contact with an overlying epithelial tissue. So an underlying connective tissue is almost always in contact with an overlying epithelial tissue. One interesting thing about epithelial tissue, it is avascular. It has avascularity, meaning it doesn't have blood vessels. These cells up here receive their nutrients, oxygen and sugar, blood sugar, glucose, from the underlying tissue. The underlying connective tissue is vascularized. It does have blood vessels. So oxygen and nutrients have to diffuse past the basement membrane into these cells to give them nutrients. Now, where we have really thick skin, like let's say on the palms of your hands or soles of your feet, the overlying cells that are furthest away from the basement membrane and their source of nutrients down here, those cells, they starve as they migrate out. They eventually die. So we are actually covered on our skin by a layer of dead cells, and they flake off and wear off. That may sound weird, but that's actually a good defense against pathogens, bacteria, for example, or viruses that have a difficult time infecting dead cells. And you can verify that your epithelial tissue, where it's thick in particular, like your palm of your hands, you can verify that it's avascular. If you go into the kitchen, you're slicing a tomato or something, and you accidentally cut yourself, like on your palm of your skin, and the cut is shallow, it just kind of cuts the skin slightly, it won't bleed. You can see the wound, you can see the opening, but it won't bleed because the cut did not go all the way down into the underlying connective tissue. So we've experienced that before, where a shallow cut will not bleed because it only cut through the epithelial tissue, because it is avascular. It is very regenerative, so it has regeneration. There are basal stem cells down here at the boundary, at the basement membrane, and those stem cells are highly mitotically active. They divide by mitosis to produce new cells that get pushed out. So your skin cells on the surface of your body are constantly flaking off. They are dead. They're constantly wearing off, which means they need to be regenerated by the stem cells right at the basement membrane. And they reproduce, mitosis, and those cells slowly but surely migrate out to the apical surface. All right, functions. Protection. It's a covering on our body and covering within passageways. Controls permeability. It's a boundary layer, and if you think of your skin, it's essentially dry, and that helps us from losing excess moisture. When we sweat, that's a cooling mechanism, so that's an exception. Provides sensation. So your epithelium is innervated to touch. So for example, if you slightly touch your skin, or you slightly brush the hair on your arm, or something like that, or the hair on your head, you can feel that. You can feel that. If you close your eyes and gently touch your skin, you can feel that, because that epithelial layer of your skin is innervated. There's nerve endings for touch sensation, temperature sensation, pain, that sort of thing. Okay? If you pull out a hair, pluck your eyebrows, you can feel it, because those hair follicles are innervated. Secretions, as I mentioned, sweat. This is secretion that allows us to cool off. We also have oil glands, sebaceous glands, that keep our skin moisturized and our hair moisturized. So secretion is a function of your epithelial layers on your body. Excuse me. Okay, so intracellular connections. We mentioned these before. There's gap junctions, tight junctions, desmosomes. Gap junctions connect cells together and allow them to communicate. Tight junctions provide impermeable junctions between cells. Right? Things cannot squeeze between the cells, substances, molecules, liquids. And then desmosomes are nice, strong, adhering junctions that prevent cells from getting pulled apart. Okay, how do we classify, how do we name epithelia or epithelial types? First, we look at the layers of cells. How many cells thick is that particular epithelium? If it's only one cell layer thick, if it's very thin, then we call it a simple epithelium. If it's more than one layer thick, that means more than one. Like this here, multiple cells thick, then it's called stratified. Okay. Then we consider, what is the shape of the cells on the top, on the apical surface? Are those cells flattened, like these here? In which case we would call it a squamous type of epithelium. Are those top apical cells kind of cuboidal, kind of like the shape of an ice cube, or I guess a marshmallow? Then we would say there was a cuboidal epithelium. Are those top apical cells columnar, like a tall can of iced tea, for example? In that case, we would say it's a columnar epithelium. And we put these two names together. So for example, we'll get to that in the next slide or so. So the top apical cells would be squamous, meaning flattened, cuboidal, or columnar. Okay? So let's put that terminology together and look at one type of epithelium that's called simple squamous epithelium, meaning one cell layer thick, simple, squamous, those cells are flattened, and it's an epithelium, it's a covering somewhere in the body, or a lining somewhere on the body. So I'll go back again here. This example here, this simple diagram, that's the basement membrane. So this is a enlarged view of a simple, one layer thick, squamous epithelium. This one down here would be a stratified squamous epithelium. It's a little hard to see, but these top apical cells are kind of flattened. These are cuboidal, but they're not on the apical top surface. So this is a stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, let's go to a simple squamous epithelium. Where would you, what's its basic function? Well, it's very thin. It's only one cell layer thick, which means it's good for diffusion. And it's found in places where we have serous membranes. And we mentioned that, I think, in chapter 1 or 2, like the pleura surrounding our lungs, or the peritoneum, that tissue membrane surrounding our internal organs. Or like, say, in your lungs, where you would want a simple squamous epithelium for your little air pockets in your lungs called alveoli that would work really well with diffusion of gases. Okay? Stratified squamous epithelium is next, and we'll get to that one in our next lecture.